Jessica thought she had the perfect excuse to keep William at a distance. They worked together. There were rules, lines that couldn't be crossed. But what happens when William decides those rules don't apply anymore? This time, he's not just playing games. He's making a choice. A bold, unexpected decision that shakes Jessica's entire world. And now, she has to figure out what happens next. Will she let her walls crumble? Or will she run before it's too late? Now, let's dive in. The next morning, when Jessica walked into the office, she immediately noticed something different about William. He seemed even more intense than usual. His usual calm demeanor was tinged with something else, something unspoken that hung in the air around him. He didn't approach her directly, no overt attempts at conversation, but his eyes, they spoke volumes. Every glance, every look he threw her way felt like it carried 1,000 unspoken words, and each one made her nervous. During the project meeting, it became clear that he was deliberately trying to provoke her. He challenged her ideas, questioned her proposals, and threw in subtle jabs that made the room feel heavier with tension. Every word he spoke seemed like a game, and he was playing it expertly, pushing her buttons just enough to keep her on edge. By the end of the meeting, Jessica was beyond frustrated. It wasn't just the professional tension anymore, it was personal. This had gone too far, and she wasn't going to let it slide. As soon as the last of the employees left the conference room, she stood up from her chair, determination in every step. She walked straight up to him. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice firm, more controlled than she felt. William closed the folder he had been flipping through, his eyes still locked on her. The calmness in his expression only made the situation more unbearable, but underneath that calm, she could see the hidden intentions, the quiet challenge that made her want to snap. "Of course," he replied, his tone as collected as ever. They walked into an empty meeting room. Jessica shut the door behind her, the click of it echoing in the quiet space. She crossed her arms and faced him, her chest tight with frustration. "What was that?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face for any sign of an answer. "Was what?" William replied, his voice cool as though he genuinely didn't understand her frustration. "The constant provocation during the meeting. Are you testing my limits?" she pressed, her patience running thin. He tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were an enigma to be figured out. His gaze didn't leave hers for a second. "And if I am?" Jessica's frustration flared, but she took a deep breath to calm herself. "What do you want, William?" He stepped closer to her, and Jessica felt her heartbeat quicken. The distance between them was closing, but she couldn't figure out why it felt more suffocating than ever. His presence seemed to take over the room, and it was all she could do to keep her composure. "You know what I want," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made her throat tighten. She swallowed hard. "This can't happen." He didn't react right away, he just stood there, his eyes never leaving hers. "Why not?" Because it's complicated," she stammered, not wanting to admit the truth. It wasn't just about professional boundaries. It was about something far messier. William's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Everything in life is complicated, Jessica." Her patience was wearing thin, the tension between them building to an unbearable level. "William, we work together. That's already a huge problem." He stood silently for a few moments, his gaze searching hers, as though weighing her words carefully. Then, just as she thought he was going to dismiss her concerns with one of his usual cryptic responses, he said something that made her entire body tense up. "What if I told you I'm leaving the project?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "What?" William exhaled slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "I'm transferring my share in the Richmond Tower to another investor." Her stomach twisted at the words, her mind racing to process what he was saying. "Wait, what does that mean?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It means I'm stepping away, but it doesn't change anything, Jessica. Not between us." "This is crazy. Why?" Jessica's voice trembled slightly, the shock clear on her face. William offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Because now there's no reason for you to keep running away." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mind raced to understand what was happening. "You can't just walk away from an investment because of this." "I can do whatever I want, Jessica," he said, his tone calm yet charged with intent. "And what I want is you." The silence in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. Jessica stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say next. All the walls she had built to keep him at arm's length, every excuse, every reason she had used to justify pushing him away, were suddenly meaningless. They were gone, swept away by his words, and in their place was something raw, something frightening. The truth she had been denying, and that truth terrified her. I need some time to think," she said finally, her voice shaky as she turned away, her mind spinning. William didn't stop her. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering, like a magnet pulling at her. "Think, Jessica, but think carefully." She fled the room, her heart pounding in her chest, but as she walked away, a quiet voice inside her whispered that she wouldn't be able to run for much longer. The game had changed, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Jessica stepped out of the meeting room, her heart racing, her mind spinning. It felt as though the ground was giving way beneath her, like everything she thought she knew about control and boundaries was unraveling. William Fisher had actually done it. He had walked away from a multi-million-dollar investment. Just like that. And the reason? Her. His words reverberated through her mind, louder than anything else. "I can do whatever I want, Jessica, and what I want is you." She couldn't breathe. The weight of his confession, the implications of his actions, crushed her chest. She needed space, needed to escape the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. She needed to breathe, to think, to somehow find clarity in the chaos. But no matter where she turned, it was as if his presence was there, pressing down on her. His gaze, his words haunted her every step. He already knew what she had been denying, what she had refused to face, the way she felt. The one thing she couldn't admit. Jessica walked to her office in a daze, barely aware of the people around her, their voices blurring into a hum. Her hands moved mechanically as she grabbed her things, stuffing them into her bag without looking. She didn't say a word to anyone. The world outside the walls of her office was distant, irrelevant. She couldn't deal with this right now. She needed to leave, to get away from everything that was now pressing down on her. So she walked out, leaving the office behind, leaving the suffocating tension of the building, hoping to find some kind of peace, even if only for a moment. But deep down, she knew that peace was nowhere to be found. Not as long as William Fisher was in the picture. It was already nighttime when Jessica realized she had been wandering aimlessly for almost an hour. Her legs were tired, each step feeling heavier than the last, and yet her mind was racing at an overwhelming pace. The thoughts wouldn't stop, the questions piling on top of one another, each one leading to another dead end. Nothing seemed to provide the answers she was looking for. She pushed open the door of a quiet cafe, its warm lights beckoning her inside, and ordered a strong coffee, hoping that the bitterness would somehow cut through the confusion. Taking a seat by the window, she gazed out at the city, its lights flickering like distant stars, and let the world outside blur, hoping it would quiet the storm inside her head. Jessica had never been the kind of person to give in. Not to anyone, and certainly not to anything. She had built her life around rationality, around control, her career, her independence. These had always come first, above everything else. They were her fortress, the walls that kept her safe from the complications of personal attachments, from the vulnerabilities that came with letting someone in. And then William Fisher came along. In the moment they had met, he had disrupted the delicate balance she had worked so hard to maintain. He challenged her in ways no one else had, provoked her, made her feel things she didn't want to feel. He had a way of getting under her skin, of making her question everything she thought she knew about herself, her choices, her priorities. And now, just when she thought she had everything figured out, he had done the unthinkable, torn down the last barrier she had used to keep him at arm's length. The investment, the project, those were her excuses, her reasons to keep things professional, to keep things safe. His words echoed in her mind. "What if I weren't your investor? What would you do?" She closed her eyes, her fingers curling around the warmth of the coffee cup, her grip tightening as if it could hold back the tidal wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She knew the answer. She had known it all along. But admitting it? That was something else entirely. By the time Jessica got home, it was well past 11. The apartment was cloaked in darkness, the silence hanging heavy in the air. She tossed her bag onto the couch with a quiet thud and let out a long, frustrated sigh. The weight of the day, of everything that had happened, settled on her shoulders like an anchor. Her phone vibrated, cutting through the stillness. Without thinking, she reached for it, and when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. "William?" She froze, her finger hovering over the screen. She could ignore it, pretend she hadn't seen the call, pretend the tension wasn't there, that the uncertainty didn't gnaw at her from the inside out. But something held her in place, something that made her pause. It wasn't a message, it was a call. He was calling. The impulse to ignore it battled with the undeniable pull to pick up. She swallowed hard, feeling the familiar knot tighten in her throat, and finally answered, "Jessica." His voice slid through the line, deep, steady, but underneath there was an unmistakable current, something dangerous, something full of hidden intentions. "What is it, William?" she asked, her voice betraying only a fraction of the tension swirling inside her. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone measured, calm, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. Jessica closed her eyes, trying to remain in control, trying to keep her thoughts from spiraling. "We've talked enough at work," she replied, keeping her voice even, but she could feel the weight of her words, the unspoken boundary she was trying to draw. But William didn't let it rest. "I'm not talking about work." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. It filled the space, and for a moment, neither of them moved or spoke. Jessica felt her chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Her mind raced, and she found herself struggling to breathe through the sudden rush of emotions. "I don't know if I can deal with this right now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, the vulnerability slipping through despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Then tell me when," William replied, his voice calm, but it was impossible to ignore the trace of determination beneath it. She had no answer, no words to explain the confusion swirling inside her. There was no right time, no perfect moment to confront this tangled mess of feelings. She felt stuck, unable to move forward or retreat. William sighed on the other end of the line, the sound so faint it almost felt like a concession. "I'll see you tomorrow then. Good night, Jessica." Before she could respond, the call ended. She was left staring at the screen, her fingers still gripping the phone as though it might somehow anchor her to the reality she was desperately trying to hold on to. Her breathing was unsteady and her mind felt like it was spinning. She should be relieved, right? He had given her space. He hadn't pushed her. But instead there was only a gnawing emptiness, a sense of something unresolved that refused to be ignored. And in that moment, it hit her like a wave, crashing over her, sweeping her away with its undeniable force. She didn't want to run, she wanted to see him. The next day started like any other. At least Jessica tried to convince herself it did. But with each passing minute, the tension in her chest grew. Her thoughts kept drifting to one undeniable truth. William would come for her. And when he did, it was never in half measures. By the time the clock struck 6, Jessica had already gathered her things. She needed to get away, to escape the office, to clear her mind and regain some semblance of control over the mess swirling inside her. She made her way out of the office, her steps quick and purposeful, but as soon as she reached the door, there he was. Leaning against his car, casually dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his eyes locking onto hers with that signature intensity she could never ignore. The man had a way of making every inch of space between them feel charged with electricity. Jessica stopped in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. "Are you really going to pretend you didn't see me?" he asked, his voice smooth with an edge of amusement, yet his gaze never wavered. Her pulse quickened and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before meeting his eyes. "What do you want, William?" Without missing a beat, he opened the car door, the invitation simple but loaded with intention. "Get in." She could feel the resistance building inside her, the desire to say no, to fight against this overwhelming pull. But then, as she closed her eyes, she knew. There was no point in resisting. She wanted to go, she just couldn't admit it. So, in silence, she stepped forward and slid into the car, her heart pounding in her chest as the door shut behind her. They drove in silence, the tension between them thick and palpable, like an invisible force weighing heavily in the air. The soft hum of the engine and the faint sounds of the city outside were the only noises. but they didn't fill the space between them. William didn't say a word about their destination, but Jessica knew exactly where they were heading. He was taking her to his penthouse, and for the first time, she didn't argue. There was no point. She knew what this was, what was happening, and part of her didn't want to fight it anymore. When the car finally came to a stop, William exited first and opened her door for her. Jessica hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her mind, but then she stepped out, her breath caught in her throat. The elevator ride was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the mechanism as it carried them up. She couldn't stop thinking about the man beside her, the intensity of his presence, the way he seemed to command everything in his vicinity, and how much he unnerved her. When the elevator doors opened, William led her into the spacious living room, his movements fluid and confident. Jessica followed him, unable to tear her eyes away from him, even though every part of her screamed to stop. He took off his jacket and unbuttoned the top of his shirt as if it was a casual, effortless movement. But to Jessica, it felt like everything was shifting. He grabbed 2 glasses of wine, handing one to her with a quiet, almost knowing smile. She took the glass, fingers trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. She drank a sip, trying to focus on the cool taste, trying to ignore the fact that he was standing just inches away, his presence suffocating yet magnetic. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the question hanging between them like a challenge. William studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing, as if he was seeing straight through her. Then, in that same calm, measured voice, he answered, "Because you didn't want to run." Her heart skipped a beat. "And what if this all goes wrong?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly, betraying the vulnerability she desperately tried to hide. He took a step closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from him. "And what if it goes right?" he murmured, his voice low and almost tempting. Jessica swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to leave before things spiraled further than she could control. But she knew deep down that it was too late. She had already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. And in that moment, she couldn't lie to herself any longer. She wanted him. Nothing else mattered. The fear, the doubts. All of it faded away when William cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle yet possessive, before his lips captured hers in a kiss that was both everything she had feared and everything she had wanted. It was intense, it was sure. Without hesitation, and in that single kiss, Jessica knew that there was no turning back. As if he had always known this moment was inevitable, William stood before her, an unspoken understanding in his eyes. Jessica, who had fought against this for so long, felt her resolve crumbling. She had tried to keep distance, to push him away, but now, standing in front of him, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. She wanted him. William's touch was gentle but firm, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. One hand settled on her waist, pulling her closer, while the other cradled her face, his thumb grazing her skin in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. For a fleeting moment, Jessica's mind went blank. Her hands instinctively found their way to his shoulders, gripping them tightly, as if they were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Time itself seemed to stand still. She could hear the steady beat of her heart, louder than ever, the only sound in the silence between them. But then, like a crash of waves against a shore, reality swept over her. What was she doing? Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, her chest rising and falling erratically. Her heart raced, not just with desire but with fear, the weight of everything they had built, everything she had worked so hard to protect, pressing down on her. With a sudden force she didn't know she had, Jessica pulled back, her hands pushing against his chest to create the smallest of distances between them. She gasped for air, as if the moment had stolen the breath from her lungs. I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. William stood motionless, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. If anything, it seemed as though he had anticipated this exact reaction. His expression softened, but there was an unspoken challenge in his eyes. "Why?" he asked quietly, his voice low but full of weight. Jessica's heart ached. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to gather her thoughts, but everything inside her felt like a chaotic storm, a mess of emotions she couldn't untangle. "This can't happen, William," she said, her voice breaking, the words tasting bitter as they left her lips. William didn't step away. Instead, he took a small step closer, his eyes never leaving hers, as though trying to understand, to read the answer she wasn't giving him. "Give me a real reason," he challenged, his tone gentle but insistent. Her mind raced. How could she explain this? How could she put into words everything that was tearing her apart inside? "This is crazy," she murmured, almost to herself. "This is crazy, and you know it." William didn't flinch. Instead, his lips quirked in a slight smile, almost as if he found her hesitation both endearing and frustrating. "And what's normal, Jessica?" he asked, his voice unwavering. She clenched her jaw, her frustration rising. "If I give in," her voice faltered, and she forced herself to continue, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "Then what? What happens next?" The question hung in the air, the unspoken fear of the unknown stretching between them. And for a moment, Jessica felt herself teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. William crossed his arms, his posture unwavering, his expression as calm and composed as ever. But beneath that exterior, there was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a subtle challenge that made the air between them feel charged. "We figure it out, together," he said, his voice steady, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Jessica let out a humorless laugh, the sound hollow and distant in the otherwise silent room. "Just like that?" she asked, incredulous, unable to mask the disbelief in her voice. "Just like that," he replied, his confidence unwavering, as though he knew exactly how this would unfold. And for a moment, something inside Jessica tightened, a weight pressing against her chest, threatening to suffocate her. It wasn't just the situation or the overwhelming emotions. It was the realization that this was real, that he wasn't backing down, that neither of them could hide from the truth anymore. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible yet carrying the weight of every unspoken fear. William nodded slowly, acknowledging her words, but there was a quiet strength in his gaze. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. But what he said next completely unraveled her. "I won't force you, Jessica, but stop lying to yourself." His words pierced through her, sharp and direct, cutting through the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. It felt as though he had seen right through her, to the heart of everything she had been avoiding, and for a brief moment, Jessica wondered if he knew her better than she knew herself. She held her breath, the silence between them growing longer, heavier. The words swirled in her mind, but she couldn't find the strength to respond. What could she say? The truth was undeniable, and yet, she wasn't ready to face it. Finally, with a sense of finality that made her stomach twist, Jessica turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't look back. But deep down she knew everything had changed, forever. The days that followed were a grueling test of endurance for Jessica. Every moment felt like an exercise in restraint, each day a challenge to keep her emotions in check. She did everything she could to avoid William at the office, an artful dance of subtle distance and careful avoidance. In meetings, her responses were clipped, short and efficient. She kept her focus on the task at hand, her eyes never lingering too long on him. Whenever their gazes accidentally met, she quickly shifted her attention elsewhere, unable to bear the weight of the unspoken tension that hung between them. And when the office started to empty out, she stayed behind just a few extra minutes, pretending to wrap up work, just to make sure she wouldn't run into him. But William didn't make it easy. Though he didn't push for conversations, his presence was like a constant, palpable reminder that he was waiting for her. And every time their eyes met, Jessica could feel the pull, the magnetic force between them, impossible to ignore, impossible to push away. The conflict inside her grew more unbearable by the day, threatening to consume her. Then, one night, the dam finally broke. It was late, far later than she'd intended. She had been reviewing blueprints for a new project, her mind absorbed in the work. Time slipped by, unnoticed, and before she knew it, the office was nearly empty. The hallway was bathed in the dim glow of security lights, casting long shadows across the polished floors. As Jessica gathered her things and stepped out into the hallway, she didn't expect to see him, but there he was, standing just around the corner, waiting as though he had known she would be leaving at that exact moment. William was leaning against his car, his arms crossed, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was calm, composed, as if he had all the time in the world. And yet, there was an unmistakable intensity in his eyes, a silent challenge hanging in the air. Jessica froze. Her first instinct was to turn around, to walk the other way, to keep running from the truth she'd been avoiding for so long. But then, just for a moment, she allowed herself to acknowledge something she had been denying. She wanted to see him. She wanted to hear his voice again, to feel that electricity that had sparked between them the night they had kissed. She was tired of the fight, tired of pushing against something that felt so inevitable. She closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of her decision settle in. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened up and walked toward him, each step bringing her closer to the moment she could no longer avoid. "Are you waiting for me?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. William raised an eyebrow, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at his lips as he looked at her, as if he had already known the answer. He didn't seem the least bit surprised by her hesitation. In fact, there was a calm certainty about him, as if he'd been expecting this all along. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too assured. Jessica let out a long, heavy sigh, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her chest. "William," she started, but her words trailed off, as if she didn't quite know how to finish the sentence. Without missing a beat, he cut her off, his tone unyielding. "Get in the car." She stood there for a moment, her arms crossed defensively, feeling a mixture of frustration and the undeniable pull she felt toward him. "And what if I say no?" she retorted, her voice tinged with defiance. William's lips curved into a knowing smile, his gaze unwavering. "You won't," he replied, his confidence almost infuriating. Jessica clenched her jaw, her frustration mounting as she fought against the certainty in his words, but deep down, she knew he was right. Despite everything, despite the inner turmoil, there was something in her that couldn't refuse him. With a resigned sigh, she finally slid into the car, the door clicking shut behind her. William rounded the vehicle, sliding into the driver's seat with ease, and started the engine. The low rumble of the car's engine filled the space between them, but neither spoke for a moment. "Where are we going?" Jessica asked, her voice quieter now, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but his lips quirked slightly in that familiar, maddening way. "You already know," he said simply, his words carrying a weight that made her stomach tighten. And she did. Deep down, she knew exactly where this was going. William's apartment was just as flawless as she remembered. Neatly organized, minimalist yet striking, and effortlessly elegant. Each corner seemed meticulously curated, yet it held an air of familiarity, as though it belonged to him in the most intimate sense. But tonight, something felt different. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an underlying tension that had nothing to do with the immaculate space around her. Perhaps it was the fact that, for the first time, she wasn't trying to escape. She wasn't searching for a way out, a reason to flee. Perhaps it was the realization that she was exactly where she wanted to be. William removed his jacket with deliberate precision, his movements smooth and effortless. He turned to face her, his eyes intense, knowing. "Jessica," he said, his voice low and firm. This time, she didn't look away. She met his gaze fully, her heart pounding in her chest. "Say it," he urged softly, his voice a command wrapped in something more, something raw. She could feel the warmth of his body, the heat of his presence as he moved closer. It was almost suffocating in the best way. "What do you want?" His words came with a calmness that contrasted the electricity crackling between them, but there was no mistaking the intensity behind them. Jessica didn't answer immediately. The answer had been lodged in her heart for far too long, an undeniable truth she had been running from, hiding behind a wall of reasons and justifications. But now, there were no more excuses. "I want you." The words escaped her lips before she could stop them, the weight of them hanging in the air, heavy and irrevocable. William's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile, as if he had been waiting for her to say those very words. "Then stop running," he murmured. She didn't respond, not because she couldn't think of something to say, but because, for the first time in their tangled history, she didn't need to. Without a word, he reached for her hand, his touch warm, his grip gentle yet firm, pulling her closer. And in that moment, Jessica realized there was no going back. She had crossed the line that separated reason from desire. And as she let herself fall into the moment, she didn't regret a single thing. The next morning, Jessica woke up to the soft, golden light of the sun filtering gently through the curtains. Her mind was still clouded with the remnants of sleep, but as the quiet moments passed, she began to process where she was. The spacious bedroom, the crisp, cool sheets, the faint scent of wood and cologne lingering in the air, a scent that was uniquely him. And then, the memory rushed in. She turned slowly and saw William Fisher still asleep beside her. His form was relaxed, lying on his side, his chest rising and falling steadily with each deep breath. He looked at peace, completely at ease. But Jessica? She felt anything but at peace. What had she done last night? The answer was clear, but the real question haunted her. What did it mean now? What came next after this moment? She carefully slipped out of bed, her movements deliberate, trying not to disturb the stillness of the room or the man who lay there, unaware. She gathered her clothes from the floor, each piece feeling heavier in her hands as if they were tethered to something she couldn't quite grasp. She needed space, a moment to think, to process what had happened and what she was supposed to do about it. Just as she was pulling her blouse over her head, she heard his voice behind her, low and steady. Running away again? Jessica froze. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned slowly to face him. William was awake now, watching her with that gaze of his, intense, unyielding, like he could see straight through her. He was propped up against the pillow, the sheets tangled at his waist, his hair slightly tousled in a way that made her chest tighten. The sight of him, so effortlessly perfect, made her breath hitch. She swallowed hard, trying to collect herself. And not running. William raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. Then why does it look like you're trying to leave without waking me? The accusation stung more than she expected. She clenched her jaw, unwilling to admit the truth. Because I needed a moment to think. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. William just watched her, his gaze never wavering. It felt as though he was trying to read her mind, to decipher the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside her. For a long pause, he sighed, a sound filled with both frustration and understanding. Jessica. Her name lingered in the air, pulling at something deep within her. William. He didn't let her finish. Instead, he reached out, his hand extending toward her. It was a simple gesture, but it felt loaded with everything that had come before and everything that was yet to come. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at his outstretched hand, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. Could she take his hand? Could she let herself fall into whatever this was, knowing how complicated it all was? But the real question was, did she have a choice anymore? She knew that if she took his hand, there would be no turning back, no more hiding behind excuses, no more retreating into the safety of her own walls. Everything would change in that one moment. But before she could change her mind, before the weight of doubt could pull her away, she stepped forward. Her breath caught in her chest as her fingers brushed against his, and then, with a final, resolute movement, she placed her hand in his. The world seemed to slow as William pulled her back onto the bed, his eyes never leaving hers. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming, yet there was a vulnerability to it, a silent question that hung between them. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice a whisper, as though afraid to hear the answer. Jessica's heart raced in her chest, and for a split second, she thought about what she should say. She should regret it, she should pull away, run, and convince herself this was a mistake. But the truth was different. "No," she breathed out, the words slipping past her lips with a finality she hadn't expected. William's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It was the kind of smile that spoke volumes, one that said he had already known the answer, even before she did. "Then stop," he murmured, his voice soft but firm. "Overthinking." She wanted to stop, to silence the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. But it was impossible. Her mind was a mess of questions, fears, and desires, an overwhelming tangle of emotions that she couldn't untangle. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragile moment between them. William's finger traced a slow, deliberate path along her cheek, sending shivers down her spine. His touch was light, gentle, but it felt like an anchor, grounding her in the reality of what was happening. "Now we see where this takes us," he said, his voice steady as though he was embracing whatever came next without hesitation. Jessica held his gaze, feeling something shift deep within her. For the first time, she realized that William wasn't the one in control of everything. He was just as caught up in this as she was, just as vulnerable, just as uncertain. And that realization scared her even more than the fear of what might happen, but at the same time, it made her feel alive. Everything had changed. In the days that followed, Jessica and William fell into an unspoken rhythm, a routine neither of them defined, but both understood. At work, they maintained the same professional exterior, the same polished facade, no lingering touches, no flirtatious glances, no overt signs that anything had changed. But it had, and the tension between them, it only grew stronger with every passing day. Every time they shared the same space, whether it was a meeting, a quick exchange in the hallway, or just a passing moment in the office, Jessica could feel it. The air seemed to hum with unspoken electricity, as if something was just waiting to snap. Every word spoken, though seemingly casual, felt laden with hidden meanings. Every fleeting glance seemed like a wordless conversation. They had become experts in the art of restraint, pretending that nothing had shifted, but inside, everything had. At night, the distance they'd so carefully constructed during the day would crumble, leaving them yearning for each other. Their wills would weaken, the weight of their silent connection pulling them together time and time again. It was as though something invisible, something beyond their control, kept drawing them in, compelling them to return to one another again and again. No matter how many times they tried to walk away, something kept bringing them back. But eventually, the back and forth wasn't enough anymore. Neither of them could deny it any longer. The need for more had become undeniable. Jessica was seated at her desk, poring over the final adjustments to the Richmond Tower project, when her phone vibrated, disrupting her focus. She glanced down at the screen. "William, come to my office." Her brow furrowed. An unexpected meeting? With a sigh, she gathered her papers, tucked her tablet under her arm and stood up, making her way down the hallway. She tried to maintain a calm composure, but her heart was already racing, her mind spinning with possibilities. The moment she stepped into his office and closed the door behind her, she knew this wasn't just another work conversation. William was standing by the window, hands buried in his suit pockets, gazing out over the city below. His posture was stiff, his usual confident demeanor replaced by an unmistakable tension in his shoulders. Jessica hesitated for a moment before crossing the room, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He turned slowly, and when their eyes met, she immediately sensed something was off. His usual calmness had been replaced by an intensity that unsettled her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. Her breath caught in her throat. He had never started a conversation like that before. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William took a deliberate step forward, his gaze unwavering. "About us." Jessica's stomach twisted, a knot forming in her chest. "What about us?" she asked, her mind racing. William paused, as if choosing his words with deliberate care before answering. "This is becoming more serious than I expected." Her chest tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She simply watched him, waiting for him to say more. "And is that a problem?" she managed to ask, though her voice shook slightly. He didn't respond right away, and that silence spoke volumes. Her heart sank. A bitter taste filled her mouth, and the words slipped out before she could stop them. "Do you want to end this?" William ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she knew meant frustration. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with conflict. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained. The words hit her harder than she expected. She took a step back, her mind reeling. "You don't know?" she repeated, the disbelief clear in her tone. He took a deep breath, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Jessica, you know I'm not the kind of man who gets involved." Her chest tightened painfully. Her pulse quickened. "Then why did you start this?" The words were out before she could stop them, and the question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. William stood there in silence, his jaw tense, as if struggling to find the right words to say. But nothing came. And in that silence, Jessica realized something profound. She was in too deep. completely and irrevocably invested in this, in him, and yet he still wasn't sure. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, humorless and sharp as she shook her head in disbelief. "You say you're not the kind of guy who gets involved," she said, her voice dripping with irony, "but here you are. Involved." William clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening with frustration. She could see the words on the tip of his tongue, the denial, the defense, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Jessica exhaled sharply, a heavy sigh escaping her lips. Her hand rose to her face as if to wipe away the overwhelming emotions that threatened to consume her, but she couldn't ignore the ache building inside her, deep in her chest. "If you're telling me this now, William," she said, steadying herself as best as she could, "it's because you've already made up your mind." He remained silent, his gaze still locked on her, but the absence of his response was louder than anything he could have said. And that silence, the uncertainty, the hesitation, hurt her more than any harsh words ever could. Jessica wasn't the kind of woman to beg for someone's affection. She wasn't the type to twist herself into something she wasn't just to hold on to a fleeting connection. No, that was never who she was. So, in that moment, with the weight of his indecision suffocating her, she did the only thing she could do. She stepped back. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible, the pain she was feeling threatening to break her. William's face showed surprise, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, but it didn't matter now. She had made her decision. "Jessica, you don't have to say anything else," he murmured, reaching out as though to stop her. But she shook her head, a finality to her gesture. "I understand," she whispered, her voice a mere breath as she turned away. Without another word she walked out, her steps steady, but the moment the door clicked shut behind her, she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They streamed down her face, a silent testament to the battle within her, a battle she knew she'd never truly win. Jessica didn't go home that night. The city streets were alive with the hum of late-night activity, but it all felt distant, almost muted, as she walked aimlessly through the urban maze. Her feet carried her without any destination in mind, just the need to move, to escape the crushing weight of everything that had happened. The cold air nipped at her skin, but it couldn't numb the ache that had taken root deep inside her. For hours she wandered, her mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts, desperately searching for some way to stop feeling what she was feeling. But the harder she tried to push it away, the more intense it became. She had fallen in love with William Fisher. That truth hit her like a wave crashing against the shore, inevitable and overwhelming. No matter how hard she fought against it, no matter how many times she told herself that she couldn't afford to fall for someone so uncertain, so unready, the feeling had settled inside her, too deeply to ignore. And now here she was, walking the streets of a city that seemed to mirror the chaos in her heart. She had to move on without him. That was the painful truth she had to face. Because in the end, he had never been ready for her, never ready to meet her halfway, and that realization, sharp and bitter, cut through everything she had hoped for. Jessica slowed her steps as she reached a quiet park bench, the flickering streetlights casting long shadows. She sat down, her head in her hands, letting the tears flow freely for the first time in hours. There was no one around, no one to see her breakdown. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to mourn the love that never had the chance to bloom, the one she had given her heart to, only to be left with nothing but the echoes of a promise that would never be fulfilled. As the night stretched on, Jessica knew she couldn't change what had happened, but she would have to find a way to heal, to move forward. No matter how much it hurt, Jessica didn't go to work the next day. She spent the entire night lying awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as her thoughts churned relentlessly. She couldn't escape the pain in her chest, a weight that pressed down on her with each passing hour. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, the ache remained, a constant reminder of what she had allowed herself to feel and what she had lost in return. There was no simple solution to this. She had made the mistake of falling for William Fisher, and now all she could do was try to untangle herself from the web of emotions that had ensnared her. She had known, deep down, that this was a risk. But knowing didn't make it any easier to accept. The damage had been done, and now she had to find a way out, before it was too late for her. But for him, the problem was, he wasn't ready. And that's what hurt the most. For her, it was already too late. She had given so much of herself, and now she had nothing left but the sting of unreciprocated affection, and it felt like a loss she could never fully recover from. The next morning, she sat at the edge of her bed and took a deep breath. With shaky hands, she typed out a message to HR explaining that she needed a personal day. Then, without hesitation, she turned off her phone. She couldn't face the outside world today, not yet. Her mind was a jumbled mess, and the last thing she needed was another reminder of the reality she was trying to escape. The phone buzzed in her hand as notifications flooded in, but she didn't look at it. She couldn't. Not today. She needed space, to breathe, to think, to process everything that had happened and what it meant for her future. The office, the meetings, the constant reminders of William. It all felt suffocating. She needed distance from it all. And so she spent the day in her apartment, alone with her thoughts, hoping that with time the pain would dull, hoping that one day she'd be able to move on. But deep down, she feared she might never truly let go. When the second day without Jessica at work began, William knew, deep down, that he had made a mistake. The previous night had been a sleepless one, with his mind replaying every word of their conversation over and over again. He could still hear her voice, the hurt in it, the quiet resignation that had settled in when she walked away, and one line echoed louder than the rest. "I'm not the kind of guy who gets involved." The look she had given him in that moment was still etched in his mind, a haunting reminder of everything he had failed to see, everything he had failed to acknowledge. Because that line, it wasn't true. Not for him. Not anymore. He had tried so hard to keep his distance, to keep his emotions under control. But it hadn't worked. He was involved, more than he had ever allowed himself to be, more than he was comfortable with. And in that moment, in the stillness of his own self-reflection, William realized something that terrified him more than anything else in his life. He had become what he feared most. He had let himself care. He had let himself want her. And now it was too late. He didn't know what to do about it. He didn't know how to fix the mess he had made, how to undo the distance he had created between them. For the first time in his life, he was out of answers, and that thought alone left him feeling lost. William had always prided himself on being in control, but right now, with Jessica absent and the silence between them deafening, he realized that control wasn't something he had anymore. By late afternoon, Jessica heard the doorbell ring. She frowned, unsure of who it could be. She wasn't expecting anyone. But as soon as she opened the door, her heart nearly stopped. There he was. William Fisher, standing on her doorstep, his hands casually tucked into his coat pockets, his eyes burning with intensity and determination. She instinctively gripped the door tightly, her first impulse to shut it and walk away. "No," she said flatly, her voice steady but laced with the weight of everything she was feeling. But William didn't flinch. He didn't back away. His presence remained solid, unyielding. "Can we talk?" "I have nothing to say to you," Jessica replied, trying to close herself off from the rush of emotions threatening to rise within her. "But I have something to say to you," he countered, his tone soft but firm. She clenched her teeth, irritation and hurt flooding her chest. "I've already heard enough, William." He sighed, frustration evident in his posture as he ran a hand through his hair. He was clearly struggling with something deep. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. Jessica felt a tightness grip her chest, but she refused to let it show. She didn't want to give in. "Yes, you were," she replied coldly. William's eyes softened as though seeing her in a new light. Seeing the hurt he had caused, for the first time he looked vulnerable. "Jessica," he began slowly, his words careful. "I'm not a man who deals well with emotions. That's never been part of my life. I never needed it." Jessica's frustration bubbled up again and she rolled her eyes. "Oh, good for you. Now tell me, what does that have to do with me?" "It has everything to do with you," he said, his voice lower, almost pleading. "Because you changed everything." She opened her mouth to fire back a sharp retort, but the words caught in her throat. William continued, his voice more desperate now. "I wanted to walk away before it got worse, but the truth is, it already has," she interrupted, her breath shaky, the lump in her throat growing. He paused, as if gathering the strength to say what had been weighing on him for so long. Then, he did something she never expected. He took a step closer and, without warning, cupped her face in his hands. His touch was gentle but unwavering, and for the first time, he whispered words that shattered the walls she had built up. "I am in love with you." Jessica froze, her heart stopping for a moment, unable to comprehend the gravity of what he had just said. Her breath hitched, her pulse racing in her ears. "What?" she whispered, barely able to find her voice. William's eyes locked onto hers, his gaze unwavering, filled with nothing but truth. "I'm in love with you, Jessica." He took another step toward her, the space between them narrowing until it was just the two of them, in that moment, in that shared truth, and I'm completely lost in it. Jessica stood there, completely still, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined hearing those words from William Fisher, not in a million years. The man who had kept his emotions buried, the man who had held her at arm's length, now stood before her, vulnerable, his heart laid bare, and suddenly, everything she had been running from, everything she had feared, didn't seem so important anymore. But then, something even more terrifying struck her. She didn't want him to be lost. She wanted to find him. The realization hit Jessica with the force of a tidal wave. She had been running, holding herself back, but deep down, she knew that the only way forward was to stop fighting what she felt. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his. "Then stop running, William." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes searching hers as if weighing the depth of her words. Instead of speaking, he moved closer, closing the space between them with a deliberate slowness that made her heart race. Then, without warning, he kissed her. This time there were no hesitations, no walls between them. Neither of them pulled away. For the first time, the weight of their connection was undeniable. Jessica and William weren't like the others. Their love wasn't about fleeting moments or unspoken words. This time, there was no more uncertainty, no more running away from what they both wanted. It was real. Finally, William pulled her in close, his arms tightening around her, as though afraid she might slip away. Jessica felt the heat of his touch, the intensity of everything they had been through, and her heart raced faster with every beat. She had never imagined hearing him say those words that had been unspoken for so long. "I'm in love with you," they echoed in her mind, and she kissed him back with all the intensity, all the longing she had kept hidden for far too long. When they finally pulled away, gasping for air, William pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, as if trying to savor the moment, as if afraid it would slip away. "This time, I'm not letting you go," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jessica smiled softly, her heart swelling with happiness. She had been afraid of this moment, afraid of the depth of her feelings, but now, she was certain. "And what if I say, I don't want to go?" William opened his eyes, and in them she saw something new, something intense and unwavering. "Then there's nothing in this world that can stop me from making you mine." In that moment, Jessica knew there was no going back. There was only forward, and with him, she was ready to take the leap. The months that followed were the happiest of Jessica's life. After so much uncertainty and hesitation, she and William had finally embraced what they had both known deep down. Their relationship, once filled with questions and fears, had transformed into something undeniable. There were challenges, of course. Working together wasn't always easy. Tensions often flared in the boardroom, where they disagreed on contracts and deadlines. But even in those moments of friction, something had changed. They had learned how to navigate the difficult balance between professional and personal, trusting each other in a way neither had before. On the quieter days, the tension between them softened. They shared intimate dinners, the kind where conversation flowed as easily as laughter. And when the night grew still, they found each other in the kitchen, exchanging stolen kisses, the warmth of their connection growing stronger with every passing moment. It was in those quiet, unspoken exchanges that Jessica realized just how much she had longed for this, how much she had needed him in her life. For the first time, Jessica felt complete. She loved him. Every part of him, the way he looked at her, the way his hand fit perfectly in hers, the way he held her when the world outside seemed too much. And William, a man who had spent most of his life controlling every emotion, every desire, found something in her that he never expected. He had learned to love her in a way that was raw, real, and unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't perfect, but it was deep and true, and for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. But even with all the happiness, William knew something was still missing. There was something more he had to do, something he had been planning for weeks now. He had never believed in grand gestures before. He had always been a man of reason, of calculated steps. But for Jessica, he was willing to throw all of that aside, because he knew this was the one thing he couldn't afford to get wrong. He had a plan, and he was going to make sure it was perfect. That night, William had something special planned for Jessica. They had been together for almost a year now, and while the love between them had deepened in ways she never thought possible, there was a strange excitement in the air, something she couldn't quite place. Little did she know, tonight would be a turning point in their relationship. The restaurant they went to had a private terrace, a hidden gem away from the bustling crowd, bathed in soft, twinkling lights that shone like stars in the evening sky. The atmosphere was intimate, the kind that made every moment feel precious. The candlelight flickered gently, casting a warm glow around them. Jessica felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest, but it wasn't until she noticed the subtle shift in William's demeanor that she realized something was different. He was more nervous than usual, a rare sight for a man who prided himself on his composure. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice playful but also filled with curiosity. The sight of him fidgeting with his wineglass told her there was more to this evening than a simple dinner. William smiled, but it was tinged with a kind of nervous energy she hadn't seen before. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he replied, his voice steady but laden with meaning. Jessica raised an eyebrow, intrigued, wondering if he was just overthinking something minor. But before she could probe further, William stood up suddenly, causing her to blink in confusion. "William, what are you?" she started, but her words caught in her throat when she saw him lower himself to one knee. Time seemed to stop. The world around them, the soft music playing in the background, the murmur of other patrons, the glow of the terrace lights, all faded into the distance. There was nothing left but William, kneeling in front of her with an open velvet box in his hand. Inside was a stunning ring that caught the light, reflecting every emotion that had been building between them for months. His eyes were filled with so much emotion, but his voice remained steady in a way that made her heart beat faster. "Jessica Carter," he began, his voice strong yet tender. "I never planned for this. I never imagined I'd be here, on one knee, asking someone to share the rest of my life with me." Jessica's breath hitched, and tears began to sting the back of her eyes. The words she had longed to hear seemed unreal, like a dream she never thought would come true. "But then you came along," William continued, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "and turned my world upside down. You made me feel things I never thought I could. You made me want something I never knew I needed." The tears flowed freely now, her hand instinctively covering her mouth as she struggled to hold back a sob. "I love you, Jessica, and I want to spend every single day of my life with you. I want to laugh with you, fight over silly things, travel the world, and come home, knowing you'll be there." His words, simple but powerful, echoed in her heart. He held her gaze with such intensity, his hand reaching out to grasp hers, and for the first time in her life, Jessica knew with every fiber of her being that this was real. This was the man she was meant to be with, the man who saw her, who loved her, who wanted a future with her. "So, will you marry me?" Jessica let out a breathless laugh, tears streaming down her face as the reality of the moment set in. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had dreamed of, was now standing before her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." And just like that, the world around them came back into focus. The people, the lights, the soft music. They all returned, but now they were simply a backdrop to the most important moment of Jessica's life. The moment where she and William stepped into forever. Spilling freely down her face, Jessica's voice cracked with emotion as she whispered, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The words came tumbling out as if her heart couldn't contain them any longer. As if on cue, the entire restaurant erupted in applause, their joyous clapping ringing in her ears. But all she could focus on was William. His eyes locked onto hers with love and tenderness. With a gentle yet purposeful hand, he slid the ring onto her finger, the diamond catching the light and sparkling like their future together. Then, without missing a beat, he stood, pulling her into his arms. Their lips met in a kiss that was deep, passionate, and full of promises of forever, of a love that would never fade. The world around them seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them, lost in the moment they had both dreamed of. And in that instant, Jessica knew there was no fear, no obstacle, no challenge strong enough to keep them apart. They had already overcome so much, and now they stood on the threshold of a life together that nothing could ever tear apart. They belonged to each other, forever. The day was perfect, an image of serenity and beauty. The sky was an endless canvas of blue, the breeze a soft whisper that brushed against the skin, and the sun bathed everything in a warm, golden glow. It felt surreal to Jessica, this day she had waited for with so much anticipation. She could hardly believe it had finally arrived. She stood in front of the mirror, taking in the reflection of herself in the stunning white gown, its delicate lace hugging her figure and flowing out in soft waves. The gown shimmered slightly as it caught the light, as if the very fabric held the weight of her dreams. The long veil cascaded down to the floor, a symbol of both the purity of the moment and the promise of new beginnings. Her hair, carefully styled into an elegant updo, framed her face perfectly, though her hands trembled just slightly as she held the bouquet of white flowers. Outside the door, the sound of soft chatter and the rustle of guests waiting eagerly filled the air. They were all there, gathered to witness the union of two hearts. But to Jessica, there was only one face she was searching for. One person whose presence made this moment complete. William stood at the altar, a figure of calm and elegance, dressed in a flawless suit that accentuated his commanding presence. Yet it wasn't his attire that made Jessica's heart leap in her chest. It was the way he looked at her. The way his eyes seemed to hold all the love in the world, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever seen. It was the kind of look that made her feel both grounded and like she could fly all at once. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as she stood at the threshold of the aisle, her heart pounding faster with every step she took toward him. She bit her lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. Each step felt like a dance of destiny, every stride bringing her closer to him, closer to the life they had built together. And then, finally, she reached him. The world seemed to disappear around them, leaving only the soft rhythm of their hearts beating as one. And then, when she finally stood beside him, her heart was racing. But the moment she felt William's hand in hers, everything fell into place. The world around them faded, leaving just the two of them in a space where only their love existed. William, with a smile that seemed to light up everything, leaned in and whispered softly, "You look beautiful." Her heart fluttered in her chest and a smile spread across her face, warming her entire being. She couldn't speak. The emotions swirling inside her were too much to put into words. And then, the officiant began the ceremony. Every word he spoke felt like a promise to their future, each sentence binding them closer together. But the moment Jessica had dreamed of her entire life came when the officiant asked the question she had been waiting for. "William Fisher, do you take Jessica Carter to be your wife, promising to love her, honor her, and stand by her side for all the days of your life?" William tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes filled with emotion as he stared at her. His voice, steady but brimming with sincerity, echoed in the quiet space around them. "With all my heart, yes." A lump formed in Jessica's throat, and she struggled to keep the tears at bay. It was everything she had imagined and more. Then, the officiant turned to her, and Jessica felt her chest swell with so much happiness that she thought she might burst. His words seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of promises. "Jessica Carter, do you take William Fisher to be your husband, promising to love him, honor him, and stand by his side for all the days of your life?" She took a deep breath, locking eyes with the man who had transformed her life in ways she never expected. He was her everything, her love, her heart, her future. And then she smiled, the kind of smile that came from the depth of her soul. "Yes, yes, forever yes," William let out a quiet laugh, his eyes sparkling with more love than she thought possible. Then, by the power vested in me. Before the officiant could even finish the sentence, William pulled her close. The world around them dissolved as he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her into a kiss that spoke volumes. A kiss that carried all their love, all their hopes, all their dreams for the future. The guests erupted into cheers and applause, but all Jessica could hear was the steady beat of her heart echoing in time with his. She laughed against his lips, feeling more joy, more contentment than she ever thought possible. It was perfect, it was real, and in that moment, she knew. This was the beginning of forever. What a journey Jessica and William have been through, full of twists, turns, and unforgettable moments. From uncertainty to love, their story reminds us that sometimes love finds us when we least expect it, and it's worth fighting for. It teaches us to be true to our feelings, trust the process, and never let fear stop us from embracing the love we deserve. What do you think of their love story? Could you relate to their ups and downs? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one.